The topic of disclosure and accommodations can be tricky to navigate at times. Hopefully, this workshop will give you an insight into the decision to disclose your disability, how to go about disclosing your disability to an employer, when you should be disclosing your disability to an employer, if at all, what kinds of accommodations are out there, and how and when to ask an employer for an accommodation. In the work that I do, I'm oftentimes asked the question, should I be disclosing my disability to an employer? Tell me what I should do. For those of you who have a limited work history, it may be the fear of the unknown, or, in other words, not knowing how employers might react to hearing the word disability. For others, you may have a personal experience with disclosure that didn't go the way that you thought it would go, or maybe you've heard stories from others who have gone through this before. The best answer that anyone can give is that it depends. The truth of the matter is that the choice to disclose a disability is a personal choice. There's no right or wrong answer when it comes to making the decision of whether or not to disclose your disability. Before you make this decision, it's important to ask yourself 3 questions. Ask yourself, why are you disclosing? Ask yourself if you really need to disclose. And finally, ask yourself if disclosing will help you in any way to get the job. The next few slides will go into more detail on when to disclose, the pros and cons of disclosure, and information on creating a script for disclosure, along with general guidelines that you can follow to help you through this process. So, when is it appropriate to disclose a disability? Typically, disclosure should occur after you have received a job offer and only if you need a reasonable accommodation. It seems like a pretty simple answer. What if you're a person who has a visible disability versus a hidden one? In this case, the disclosure process might be different. For example, a student I worked with came to me with this very issue. His disability was a visible one. He had an excellent resume and was called in for a number of interviews. However, he always felt as though the employers were looking more at his disability instead of focusing on the reasons why they called him in to interview in the first place, his abilities. This was, of course, his own perception of how people were looking at him. We discussed a way he could disclose his disability in that first face-to-face meeting so that he could clear out that so-called elephant in the room that no one would discuss. For this student, it was better for him to disclose. He decided that just before the interview began, he would state to the employer that he does in fact have a disability, as they could see, but that it in no way affects his ability to perform the functions of the job he was interviewing for. He also stated to them that if they had any questions about his abilities or about how he would go about performing these job duties, to feel free to ask him, as he would gladly answer any questions they had. This, he felt, put not only his mind at ease, but he felt it was the best way to put the employer at ease as well. Their full attention would now be on his abilities. What's best for one student might not be best for another. Remember that you do not need to say anything. Likewise, an employer cannot ask you if you have a disability. There are some pros to disclosing your disability to an employer. First of all, it may eliminate the stress of not disclosing. Again, it eliminates that elephant in the room that we just spoke about. Second, if an accommodation is necessary for the interview, the employer is aware of that ahead of time and has ample time to prepare the materials for the interview, as well as help you succeed in the first interview. Third, it will allow you to respond immediately, briefly, and positively to any questions relating to your disability and your ability to perform the job functions. This is, of course, the ultimate goal. There are also some cons to disclosing your disability. Should you decide that disclosing is appropriate for you, there is the possibility of being discriminated against even before you have a chance to prove yourself. We like to think that this doesn't exist, but the reality is that you can't be too sure. Sometimes, when the term disability is said, the focus can move to what is least important in all of this, and that is the fact that you are a person with a disability. Secondly, if you disclose, it is possible that too much emphasis will be placed on your disability rather than on your abilities. Finally, others around you may discover your disability and respond poorly or treat you unfairly. It's important to take both the pros and cons into consideration when thinking about whether or not you disclose your disability to an employer. So how do you best prepare to disclose your disability? Begin by creating a script. When you create a script, keep these things in mind. Make sure that you write the script down. It's one thing to do it in your head. However, when you write it down, you'll have the chance to read it, edit it, and make it the best it can be. Be sure not to make your script too medical, clinical, or detailed in nature. That brings up too many questions. Remember that this is a business meeting. Don't get lost in the details of your disability. Write out the script in your own words. Make sure that you feel comfortable and good about what you would say to the employer. As you create this script, be as positive as you can about you, your skills, and your abilities. You want the employer to see you as their top candidate. Be clear and concise. When creating your script, there are some questions to consider to help you along the way. Before anything, evaluate the position's duties and responsibilities. I want to stress this piece because not only is this good to do when creating a script, but also to ensure that, regardless, you're applying for the right jobs for you. What questions will you need to ask the employer to determine whether or not your disability will affect the job? What will you say when disclosing your disability? How will you describe your specific needs? What accommodations will you need, and what impact will it have on the employer, financially or otherwise? More on the accommodations piece in just a few minutes. Practice your script alone or with friends and have them critique it. Practice at least 10 times for the best results. The more you practice saying the script, the more comfortable you're going to feel about it, and, therefore, the more natural sounding it's going to become. Take full advantage of the additional resources that you may have. Talk to your career counselor for more information, input, and support. Don't be afraid to ask for assistance. Lastly, remember to be positive about your skills and abilities. There are a number of available resources that you can take advantage of on the Tufts University campus to assist you with your job search and with the topic of disclosure and accommodations. Students and alumni are encouraged to contact Career Services or Disability Services for assistance. There are some additional resources to you in the local area. You can contact the Resource Partnership, a nonprofit organization in Massachusetts dedicated to assisting job seekers with disabilities with the process of seeking and securing employment. You can also get in contact with one of the one-stop career centers in Massachusetts. There are 32 of them around the state. Additionally, you can get in touch with your local vocational rehabilitation agency as they might be of assistance as well. The bottom line when talking about disclosure is to use your best judgment. Now that we've taken some time to discuss the topic of disclosure, it's important that we now discuss the topic of workplace accommodations as they do go hand in hand. If you're thinking about disclosing your disability or have already made this decision, the next step is to figure out what workplace accommodations you will need and how to ask an employer for them. Please keep in mind that reasonable accommodations must be made on a case-by-case basis and are not required when costs would constitute an undue hardship for the employer. To break this definition down even further, you need to know what undue hardship entails. This is a legal term used to define the factors that are to be considered by an employer. This includes the nature and cost of the accommodation proposed, the financial resources of the business, and how the accommodation would affect expenses and resources, and finally, the accommodation's impact on the operation of the workplace or facility. When it comes to the term accommodation, similar to the word disability, it might be a word that can take an employer off track if he or she is not familiar with the concept. They may begin to think about how much extra time or effort this will end up being, and also how much is going to set their budget back. This is why it's of the utmost importance to know what you would need in order to perform the duties of the job. The biggest misconception from an employer's standpoint is that accommodations equals empty pockets. This is untrue in many cases. According to research done in 2004 by the Job Accommodation Network, data collected suggests that more than one-half of all accommodations cost less than $500. For many companies contributing their input to this research, the positive results of acquiring an accommodation far outweighs any perceived negatives. The following list is examples of possible reasonable accommodations: accessible materials such as large print or braille, assistive technology or equipment including JAWS or a trackball, making the workplace accessible, which can be as simple as rearranging a desk or other furniture, job restructuring, job coaching, taking a leave of absence, job reassignment or transfer, or having a part-time or modified work schedule, which would allow for daytime appointments that cannot be changed, or setting an earlier or later schedule depending upon when you work best. Here are a few examples of unreasonable job accommodations: removing from the job an essential function, anything that could lower the production standards that the job requires, or the supplying of personal use items that are also needed off the job. What is the definition of a workplace accommodation? An accommodation is any change in the work environment or in the way things are customarily done that enables an individual with a disability to enjoy equal employment opportunities. Just as with the topic of disclosure, when going to an employer with an accommodation request, take some practice. As such, the first thing you should do is to create another script. Again, write it out and practice, practice, practice. You should know ahead of time what is needed on the job and be prepared to explain to the employer what it is and how to get it. You are your own best resource in this case, so go in with the proper information and present it in a clear way. When asking for accommodations, remember to be flexible. You and your employer will need to partner up to determine the most appropriate level of support. Additionally, be sure to put your request in writing, as you never know when you may need to refer to it again. When you ask for an accommodation is key in this process. The most appropriate time to do so is after a job offer has been made. Sometimes you don't know whether or not you will need an accommodation until after you begin the job. That's okay, but if this is the case, do not wait any longer. Ask for one as soon as it becomes evident so your performance doesn't suffer and so it doesn't impact any company performance outcomes. For those people who wait until after a workplace issue to request an accommodation, they run the risk of the employer feeling betrayed, hurt, or feeling like they've been misled in one way or another by not bringing this to his or her attention. This feeling of mistrust could lead to the termination of employment. Once you do request an accommodation, the employer has the right to request relevant medical documentation to justify this request. He or she can also request that you see a medical professional of his or her choosing. The employer makes the final decision on what accommodation is reasonable and what is not. The employer can say no. Remember, once you have requested an accommodation, your employer has the right to request relevant medical documentation to justify your request. The employer makes the final decision on what accommodation is reasonable. As a follow-up to asking for an accommodation, send a thank you note to the employer or human resources professional who has helped you secure this accommodation. It's a nice personal touch that they'll definitely remember. Finally, I cannot stress enough how important it is to document, document, document. Keep a logbook or track when you asked for the accommodation, when the accommodations were received, what accommodations were received or not received, and any follow-up steps in the process along with any other documentation that you feel might be helpful down the road. You never know when this information will come in handy. Thank you for listening to this presentation. If you have any questions or would like additional information, please contact the Resource Partnership or Tufts University.